Okay, well, let's thank Caryma Sa'd for coming on to the 905er podcast today to talk about what happened on Friday just past. Caryma, thank you very much for joining Roland and myself this morning.
Thank you for having me.
Let's just dive right into it. Can you just tell us, you were at the protest at Oakville Trafalgar High on Friday afternoon. Just lay the scene for us. Can you tell us what it was like, what you saw outside the school that day?
Yeah, so I pulled up on my scooter at around 2:20, give or take, and there were people gathered outside on the sidewalk in front of the school, which is on a fairly, I assume it's regularly a quiet residential street. And I recognized some of the individuals in attendance from other protests and rallies that I have covered over the past 2 years. These are sort of individuals who are connected in some degree to the freedom movement. When school actually let out, the crowd grew in size because students also kind of joined the fray. There was, a speaker and a microphone, like a portable speaker that was being used for speeches of sorts. There was one person who actually got chased away by the protesters, who had a pretty disgusting sign with slurs on it, and it was, they didn't want to be associated with that, but even the messaging and signage that the actual group had, questionable as well. And I would say that there were people who didn't necessarily come because of the Freedom Gang, but were either parents or residents, and also present at the protest. So it was not a monolithic group, but the majority of people were these freedom protesters and students.
Why do you think they were attracted to come to this? I mean, let's be honest, like the freedom vaccination cause, if you will, really, like this is a different topic or a different subject altogether than what they usually come out for. So why do you think they were attracted to this issue to mobilize in this manner?
It's kind of funny because if your ethos is absolute freedom and individualism, then
True.
You would think that they would be on the other side of this issue.
Right.
But it's been my observation that mixed in with discussions about vaccines and mandates, etc., there are other undercurrents that reflect, I would say, right-wing talking points, including on critical race theory, gender identity, things of that nature. So what they might describe as woke culture. So I'm not altogether surprised. I've seen and heard this type of discourse at freedom rallies. It meshes with what they put out there. And I suspect that with actual mandate rules and restrictions really being rolled back to the point of being almost non-existent, the core group of protesters are now finding other issues to stand in solidarity with. And it wouldn't surprise me if this is the first of many issues that are unrelated to quote unquote freedom, but attract their attention nonetheless.
It's almost as if it wasn't even about the vaccines to begin with.
You can say that for sure. But also it's, if I'm to draw an analogy, right, like where people are attracted to an ideology or a movement, and it's an ever expanding scope. So it's hypocritical for the reason I point out that, why are you not standing behind this person's freedom? Although, there is an issue here to be protested, debatably at least. But yeah, the momentum, to gather in groups and yell and be angry, I don't see that dissipating anytime soon.
It seems like it seems to me that these, I have to make an admission here that when this story first kind of was brought to my attention, sort of through Twitter posts or whatever, I was like, oh, this isn't going to be good. and I kind of immediately, almost deliberately kind of tried to tune out. It's like, I don't want to know what's going to happen here. And it's like almost hoping that we wouldn't end up covering it on this podcast. And here we are. Because I feel like the people who are protesting this, ultimately they want things to protest, right? That it's not really, the issue is less important than the ability to kind of scream and shout and be hysterical about something, fundraise, possibly attract members, attract people to whatever media channel you might be representing. I mean, to what extent is this, do you think this is kind of manufactured outrage, at least on the part of some people involved in it?
That's probably an element of it, right? This is a salacious kind of story and topic, one that people can dig their teeth into, and one that is exemplary of the issues and grievances that this group purports to have with the government, right? It's a really extreme situation. And I think that the response from the school has given fuel to this group who, there's a religious element as well, right? If I can just sort of sidestep for a second. And that's not to say that everyone who participates in the freedom movement aligns with a particular religion, but there is a very strong faction of people who are devoutly Christian in particular. And this type of scenario, my observation is that it's, a sign that the end is nigh, up is down, down is up, and this is a good reason to be out on the streets protesting because the world has gone mad. And so, is that manufactured outrage? Not necessarily. I don't think that it's entirely, misplaced or baseless, but what I am seeing is a lot of piggybacking on this issue, and then kind of making leaps and bounds, assumptions that are not founded in any reality that I'm aware of, against this teacher specifically, against trans people more generally, and the coverage of it, it's feeding off of people's reaction to the story. And I, like you, this is not really my wheelhouse or domain. So it's not the type of story that I would typically cover, but because the freedom movement got involved, continuity, and I just wanted to see what they were up to. But the way that people are reacting, with various degrees of thoughtfulness and reasonableness, but overwhelmingly, I think it's part of a culture war, right? And so they consider themselves frontline soldiers on this culture war.
I guess we should say to listeners, we're almost deliberately not addressing the teacher concerned. I don't feel that we don't feel there's anything particular that we're going to add to that discussion that's of value that won't just make the whole situation worse. And it's more about, we're kind of interested, I guess, in the in how people are using and abusing this kind of culture war thing, or deliberately seeking to pour fuel onto the so-called culture war. I mean, you might say, what we have here is one teacher in one school. It's not that teacher that's making this into some kind of national issue, I guess. I mean, you've kind of really had the courage to really throw yourself into this whole thing, and kind of you were an otter during the Freedom Convoy protests. You've been kind of front and center, sort of viewing this thing. Do you feel that what these people are kind of protesting in all its different forms is actually representative of a genuine feeling in society that like you say, the end is nigh? Or is this more a section of society that feels that it's been sidelined over the last however many decades, kind of exploiting all the disruption of COVID and to kind of bring themselves back to the center of political discussion?
I think that there are real and genuine grievances mixed in with the people who are participating in this movement. But I think it's driven by something a lot more nefarious. And, I have previously described it as right-wing populism. I think that that's a fair way to characterize what I'm seeing. And I don't know. I'm still working through trying to understand what is going on. So I'm there and present, and can offer insight to the best of my ability. But I also am baffled and confused. And I think about sort of the arguments that we need to listen and have compassion and sort of tolerate, and those are all values that I hold dear. But at the same time, I am very aware that this group, right, however broadly construed, gets a lot more leeway than other groups with also legitimate grievances, right, and that are more clearly articulated, right? So there's discrepancies there. And overall, I see this as ushering in sort of a form of authoritarianism. And who is at the helm? I don't know that it's that simple. I don't think that there are easy answers to point to kind of, this is the puppet master. I think that there's a lot of actors on the scene. Some are after notoriety and clout, some are after fame, some are after money, power, genuinely thinking that this is a service because they are witnessing what they consider to be moral decline. It's very messy. And this type of situation, I think, serves to muddy the waters because people kind of sitting really on the outside and watching, there's a huge opportunity here to sway public opinion. And I think that that's something they're trying to capitalize on.
I want to touch upon a number of those points that you just made. I mean, I got my mind's going like a million miles an hour on this topic. It's just, there's so many angles. I agree. I don't see like a single person leading it, but I do want to kind of talk about how the board has handled this so far. Because I'm doing kind of rudimentary research on this. There, in certain Facebook groups, like neighborhood Facebook groups here in the region that I'm members of, there are people who identify, said, I've seen this individual out in public dressed this way. So I'm inclined to believe this wasn't a one-off or prank or a hoax or I'm going to choose to say this person does identify as female and this is how they want to appear, and that their intentions are sincere, whatever they may be. that being said, I do find that I'm confused about what the anger is actually about, because I can only prescribe it to be just pure transphobia or transphobia against this individual, because I was thinking, if this is a cisgendered woman who opted to dress this way, would the anger be there? Would people be driving out of their way to go to Oakville Trafalgar High School, in Oakville of all places, and say, I'm going to wait outside to the end of the school day, and I'm going to go and, make really gratuitous and explicit signs to post outside the high school? And that's what comes out of my head is this: if this was a cisgendered woman who said, I want to dress this way, would the anger be there?
I think if this was a cis woman, she would not have made it from the parking lot inside the building the first day she showed up in the attire, right?
Right.
Because I think that sort of separating the transphobia, which is very present, and so it would do a disservice to pretend that that's not an element of what's happening. But the reason this situation provides cover is the actual facts of the case, right? What's publicly available, right? And there's a lot of unverified information floating around. So I'm hesitant to, make bold assertions, but based on the images that we have seen, which have not been roundly denied by the board or the school. So if we take that to be the case, we have spandex shorts, see-through blouses, and protruding nipples. And that's all, those are choices, right? Those are choices in professionalism. And school boards, I shouldn't say school boards, but school administrations can and routinely do police women's bodies, whether it's natural or chosen, attire. Like, this is par for the course. And part of what concerns me about the handling of this is that there is an element of discrimination, because a cis woman, not even an option. This would not be an option. So the outrage then, and people driving down to the school, to me, there's a direct line that can be drawn from the response and handling of it. Is it appropriate to have someone in this attire? Is this attire professional? Is it suitable for a school? Is it suitable for shop class in particular? And I think if we focus on those questions, then it's not surprising to see that it is, generated this level of interest. And it's deeply unfortunate the voices who are loudest on this subject, may have ulterior motives that go beyond what on its face is a pretty egregious case of not abiding by code of conduct.
In your humble opinion, and you can have no comment on this, do you think the Halton District School Board dropped the ball on handling this file properly?
I don't know how much the board, because they're not responsible to my understanding. I'm not an education lawyer or an employment lawyer, but it's my sort of basic understanding that this would be the Ontario College of Teachers, and that the school, could make a referral for discipline or intervention. I do think that the statement from the school, as far as, unequivocal support, which is how it came across, I don't think that helped the situation. And I think it misses kind of an important point, which is that there's, also a duty to ensure that there's a learning and work environment that is free from harassment and discrimination. And can we construe this choice of attire as a form of harassment? Potentially.
Well, the reason why I brought it up is we asked this is unrelated to yourself, but I'm just going to keep you in the loop here. We asked the director of education to come on and have this discussion with us because they gave this an interview to Rebel Media outside their. Yeah, it's if you feel like it, go check out Rebel Media's Twitter feed, and they've posted all over it. It's all it's like a whole section on their Twitter feed. David Menzies is outside giving or asking questions to the director of education, and that's why we reached out to them and said, "Well, can you give? We want your side of the story. We'll give you."
And we will certainly be as
we were denied
responsible as possible.
Yeah,
with how we handle this.
We want to hear what your policy is.
Very sensitive.
Yeah,
you got denied and not Rebel News.
Yeah,
apparently.
Yeah. They shot us down.
That's a choice. That's also a choice. I didn't know about that. That's interesting.
That's the reason why I brought it up. I thought I was like, and I responded back to them and said, "You made a choice. You gave an interview to Rebel Media, and you're denying us an interview. We just want to know what your policy is and what your plan of action will be going forward. We understand this is sensitive, but people want to know, what are you going to do about this issue?" And they shut us down. They said,
"You can't. I mean, they really cannot talk about individual staff." HR,
I mean, that's a reasonable position, but then
I said I don't want to talk about I don't want to talk about this person specifically. I want to know what your policy will be going forward and how you're going to prevent situations like this from happening in the future. And they said, "No, we're not talking to you." I said, well,
I'll watch it, but what did they say to Rebel? Like, what was the thrust of that interview?
It was what they said. We respect all individuals and the right to expression and what. Again, they didn't say anything that I was like, oh, that's. But the fact that you're kind of feeding the fire there, because let's be honest, we know who watches Rebel Media. I'm sure a lot of the folks that you were pleasantly engaged with on Friday afternoon are subscribed to Rebel Media. And that's their right, that's their choice. But I have questions about like, how do this is a very sensitive topic, and there's a lot of people who are watching it, not just on one side but also on the other side. Those who do identify as transgender in the 905 and in Ontario looking at this, they're nervous, they're scared, they're like, this is not, we got our own fight to deal with, this isn't helping. And as an institution, they want to know, like, what, as the institution, do you have our back, or are you going to hang us out to dry? And I'm thinking that last part is still up in the air with the Halton District School Board. And I'm just asking because I want to get your take on it, because you that action, I think, fuels the behavior that we saw on Friday. If you don't kind of take a stance saying, no, this is what we're doing, this is our policy, this is the end of discussion. That in itself kind of fuels oxygen into the fire, in my experience or my take on it. Am I wrong? Am I wrong in seeing this? Or
no, I don't think you're wrong, and you're in fact it feeds right into the narrative that I think Rebel is trying to push, which is social justice run amok, and we should roll all of it back because this is the logical end result and we don't want that. So let's do away with everything. I think that that's the angle that they are taking. And speaking to them, even if you're just repeating your statement, I don't see how, but whatever, I'm not their media relations person. You can have sensitive topics, but still handle them in a way that is tethered to values and the law. And I think that's the way to navigate any tricky situation. It's not always easy or popular, the outcome, but it ought to be justifiable, especially since parents and students, who are actually directly impacted by this, they also are entitled to at least be kept in the loop, and have not necessarily input as to the outcome, but they are directly affected. So they're owed a reasonable response.
Do you think, I mean, there's, to an extent, my limited knowledge of education on Ontario or anywhere in the world is it tends to be a political football everywhere. I mean, it's always a high, it's always a high kind of subject with a high, how we discipline children, how we police what children are allowed to wear. Not I wouldn't say police, but
no, police sounds a good word.
What are the boundaries of appropriate dress that we accept today? What's appropriate dress in a workplace for any professional? And I mean, it seems to me with what I know, there's a legitimate discussion to be said about professional attire for anybody, regardless of gender, regardless of anything. Safe attire in a shop-based environment with power tools and legitimate discussion to be had there. And I guess I do. I mean, again, the involvement of the kind of extreme side of this muddies the water of that kind of valid discussion of teachers I know who say, there are children who wear things which are completely inappropriate these days. Inappropriate for anybody. Like, we should expect professional attire from everybody when they're in a working environment, and the school's ultimately a working environment. Do you think, again, is there this kind of tiny grain of validity? I really don't want to give it even that much credit, but is there a tiny grain of validity in this whole thing that the education system does kind of need to get to grips with these issues better, and rather than them pretending they don't exist? Perhaps that's the best I can kind of word it.
Our standards of what is professional are constantly changing and evolving, right? Like in the military, they're now allowed to wear their hair down, or have it colored, or have tattoos for police officers, right? So what was unthinkable a couple of decades ago, attitudes can shift. And I think that that's not a bad thing. What we have here in a school environment in particular, because there is a duty to students, and I think that should be the real guiding principle in all of this. And the question of professionalism, and even if we think about the dress code that applies to students at Halton, and it specifies, nipples and genitalia should not be visible or exposed. So right there, blatantly, black and white, you can say that only applies to students, but it's not really logical to think that it wouldn't affect teachers, especially given sort of the power dynamic that exists, right? And teachers are held to such strict standards in the way that they relate to kids and what's appropriate to joke about and what's not. And can you give them a ride in your car? Can you, there are a lot of boundaries that exist and are rigidly enforced precisely to protect students. So what I think, is happening here, it's not that, well, we have no rules and we just don't know, we don't know, it's not. There are rules, and it's a question of enforcement, and sort of the reluctance to enforce what seems, as an outsider, quite obvious. That's what's raising questions and concerns. And is it fear of a lawsuit? Is it fear of making, a situation worse? There are a lot of reasons why the answer is what it is, but I don't think that's justification to abdicate responsibility to students and to other teachers. So we go back to the facts, right? Where it's skin tight, very revealing, and artificial enlarged nipples that are protruding through the clothes. That's not okay. And, is this a situation where in 10 years, I'm going to listen back to this and I sound like a prude? Maybe, but I don't think so, because to me, what we are seeing, it's not a prosthetic that is replacing a natural body part, right? If this was a medical sort of prosthetic, or because that those come in all variety of shapes and sizes, big, small, and I think that would be sort of a reasonable standard. This looks a lot like fetish gear. And are we okay with that being in the classroom? I don't have kids, but personally, that makes me uncomfortable for the sake of the students. So that's how I see this situation.
Yeah, and it seems like there are places in our world where it's okay to push boundaries, which are the appropriate places to ask questions about dress and attire. And you made the excellent point that what we consider acceptable today is completely different from what we thought was acceptable 100 years ago. And now we'll laugh about people going swimming in the 1900s and having to wear heavy cloth dresses, and and it seems bizarre to us now, but at the time that was just the way it was. But the fact remains that schools are not the place to have that discussion. The schools need to lag society rather than be on the cutting edge, I guess, because ultimately the part of the story that is, I think we probably all agree, is just the worst part of it, is just the children who are caught up with it. Any children at HDSB, to be honest, who are questioning their gender identity, or who identify as transgender or gay, or it just brings pressure onto them that they don't need at that time in their life, and I think that's the most regrettable sort of side of this whole thing altogether. As so often happens, I've made a statement rather than asking a question. But I don't know.
No, if I could, build on that statement though. There's ample opportunity outside workout hours to explore oneself. And if it's in fact the case that people have seen this teacher in non-school settings, dressed in this way, I don't really see a problem with that. But I do see a problem where it's a work environment and a learning environment, and there are fairly clear lines that can and should be drawn in the sand, and the inability to do that only harms the groups that are supposedly we're trying to protect.
It's almost like, again, I'm coming back to the HDSB here, and that they I feel like they kind of dropped the ball in terms of turning this ironically into a learning moment. Is that there are if we're talking about true equality, right? If you're a identified trans student or teacher, staff in one of their buildings, there's something about saying like you're treated truly equally to everyone else here in the building, which means that we have we put the exact same expectations of professional conduct on you as we do everyone else. And I look at the images that were taken. I do question, just from a purely practical standpoint, I do question, like, how did this teacher work in a shop classroom wearing high heels and this get up? Because at some point, as this, just from a purely logistical WSIB point of view, he said, like this is a safety hazard. Like, you're trying to teach kids in a shop class, this is how you conduct yourself safely around this potentially dangerous equipment. Dress the part, which might mean, yeah, like work overalls, denim, some like protective clothing at all times.
Which my understanding is the rule, and yeah.
Well, that's the thing. Like
the children with long hair in shop class have
yes,
their hair up, and teachers will wear themselves out, reminding children of that fact. It's like, no, you have to put your hair up. It's dangerous.
Yes.
So yeah, I mean, there were these elements there, which again, kind of potentially gave the school board kind of an out on this. I mean, not to throw an individual staff member under the bus at all, but to say, yeah, there's an issue here that needs to be looked at, and we will look at it. And that's kind of all they needed to say. And rather than that, they gave the impression they weren't going to look at anything.
Right. Nothing wrong happened here. It's like I think the majority of people do say something wrong did happen. Like that is it's unprofessional for students and for other staff in the building. But there's also this side of your teacher in a shop class. There's a safety conduct that has to go on as well. How are you conducting yourself as the teacher in this environment to ensure that students are learning proper safety in a shop classroom? Like it's and I mean, like that's to, pardon the pun, but that's not like really a sexy issue to go and like, I want to drum up, protests about. Like nobody's going to protest, hey, there's no safety shoes being worn in that shop class. Right. I find that, this
you hit on a double standard, right? That's what this is.
Right.
It's a double standard, vis-a-vis cis women and faculty, students, right? Even like it is a double standard, evidently. And there were ways to tackle this that didn't turn it into a discussion about affirming gender identity, because that is secondary, and not an unimportant issue, but it does not supersede. It does not supersede the base requirements of safety, and safety should be understood broadly, to include freedom for everyone to have a harassment and discrimination-free experience in a school.
I'm seeing that we're coming up on our time here, so I'm going to say thank you, Caryma, for coming on to the podcast, because I think we had a more nuanced discussion about this topic than I've seen in the media in the last week. So thank you very much for taking the time to come on. And I will say thank you on the sidebar. Thank you for doing the work about following the freedom protests around the province. Do be safe out there. Because you're doing good work. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.